Picture this, not some vague future where AI might matter to security someday. I mean, right now. What if the real shift is not that AI can write code? What if the real shift is that it can read a messy environment faster than your organization can even decide who owns half of it? Old services, stale images, forgotten runners, broad IAM roles, weird sidecars, ancient dependencies, a dashboard nobody meant to leave exposed, a pipeline permission nobody wanted to untangle. That is the frame for today. Hey, I'm Brian from Teller's Tech, and this is Ship It Weekly. You can find full show notes, links, and past episodes at shipitweekly.fm. And if you've been getting value out of the show, subscribe wherever you listen and leave a rating or review. It really does help. Today is a special, just one topic: Claude Mythos preview, Project Glasswing, and what this might mean for business, security, and the way we think about DevOps, cloud, infra, and the platform risk if this is even half as meaningful as it looks. So let's start with the obvious question. Why is this worth a special? Because this does not feel like a normal model launch story. Anthropic is not framing Mythos like, hey, the coding benchmark went up again. They are framing it more like a threshold event for security. And that gets my attention. Not because I want to do the usual AI doom spiral thing, but because if offensive capability really is getting faster and cheaper, then that changes the operating assumptions underneath a lot of how companies run software. That is the part I care about. Not the hype cycle, not the branding, not whether people on LinkedIn are going to overreact for 2 weeks. I care about what this means if you run systems for a living. If you are the person dealing with cloud sprawl, aging workloads, risky exceptions, strange identity boundaries, rollout safety, patch friction, and all the messy stuff real companies carry around for years. That is why this is worth a special, because this is not really an AI story. It is an infrastructure risk story. It is a tempo story. It is a story about what happens if exploit discovery starts moving at machine speed while most engineering organizations are still patching, approving, and modernizing at human speed. And before we go deeper, I want to do a callback to our OpenClaw special for a second. That episode was really about what happens when agent tooling stops being a toy and starts acting like a control plane. Real tokens, real permissions, real blast radius. That was the point. This Mythos story is different, but it rhymes. OpenClaw was about what happens when we give software more autonomy inside messy environments. Mythos is about what happens when the capability to find weaknesses in those environments and chain those weaknesses together starts scaling faster too. So I would not call this a sequel to OpenClaw, but I do think it lives in the same broader theme. Software is getting more capable, attack surfaces are getting weirder, and the control planes around us are not always as sturdy as we pretend they are. So, what actually happened? Anthropic released Claude Mythos Preview, not as some big open general release, not as a fun playground feature. It paired it with something called Project Glasswing, which is clearly being positioned around defensive cybersecurity and critical software protection. That alone tells you a lot, because release posture matters. Companies tell on themselves a little bit by how they ship things. And when the release pattern looks more like we should probably be careful with this, that is worth paying attention to. Now, I want to be honest here, a lot of the detailed evidence right now still comes from Anthropic itself. So, this is not one of those stories where we have 20 independent teardown articles and a full year of real world data. We do not. And that means you should not just swallow every claim whole. But I also think the dumb response is to roll your eyes and call it marketing and move on. Because even if you discount the loudest version of the story, the direction of the story is pretty clear. These models are getting better at the kind of patient, iterative, technical reasoning that matters a lot in security work. Reading code, testing ideas, trying paths, rejecting dead ends, following weird clues, chaining small mistakes into bigger outcomes. That is not a toy capability. That is exactly the kind of work defenders and attackers both care about. And this is where I think the smart posture sits. Do not get gullible, but also do not get lazy. Those are two different mistakes. Getting gullible means repeating every claim like it is already fully proven and independently validated. I do not think this is reasonable. Getting lazy means hearing something uncomfortable and dismissing it because it sounds too dramatic or too early. I do not think that is smart either. The better middle ground is this. Maybe the headline version gets softened over time. Maybe some details get revised. Maybe some of the early framing turns out to be too strong. Okay, fine. But if the core trend is real, and I think it probably is, then the implication is still serious. The implication is not that AI suddenly invented security problems. The implication is that it may be making parts of offensive security cheaper, faster, and more scalable. And once that starts happening, messy organizations pay for it first. That is the key. Messy pays first. Not necessarily the company with the most code, not necessarily the company with the fanciest stack. The company with the most weak assumptions, slow cleanup, fuzzy ownership, and chainable mistakes. That is who pays first. So let's talk about what changes if this is even half true. Not all true, half true. What changes? Well, for one, platform debt becomes attacker leverage. That old base image you have not refreshed, that broad deploy role nobody wanted to narrow, that weird internal service that still trusts way too much, that forgotten runner, that weird path with too much access, that long lived secret, that temporary exception that turns 2 years old. Those things do not just sit there as background ugliness anymore. They become easier to discover, easier to reason about, and possibly easier to combine. And that combination part matters, because most real incidents are not about one perfect movie villain bug. They are about a chain, a little access here, a weak boundary there, too much trust somewhere else, an old dependency, a stale assumption, a permission that never got revisited. That is how real environments break. So, if a model gets better at following those threads with patience and speed, the problem is not just vulnerable code. The problem is vulnerable operating models. That is the line that I keep coming back to, not vulnerable apps, vulnerable operating models. Because a lot of companies do not have a pure software problem, they have a systems problem. And this is also why this is not just for AppSec people or weird infra nerds like me. Business leaders should care too, because if exploit discovery gets cheaper, then risk math changes, vendor risk changes, cyber insurance assumptions change, patch service level exceptions change, acquisition diligence changes, third party component trust gets more fragile. Legacy systems become more dangerous to leave alone. And once you get into regulated industries or older enterprises, this gets even more interesting. Because a lot of those environments are not clean, they are layered. Modern things on top of old things, cloud native things next to brittle things, shared dependencies, inherited architecture, historical compromises. Basically, every mature company has some version of this. Which means the real business question is not, should we be scared of Mythos? The better question is, are we still operating like offensive capability is scarce, expensive, or relatively slow? Because if that assumption is weakening, then defensive speed becomes more valuable, inventory becomes more valuable, rollback confidence becomes more valuable, privilege reduction becomes more valuable, and isolation becomes more valuable. That changes how you think about maturity. It stops being polish, it becomes resilience. Now let's bring this back to our world. What does this mean for DevOps, cloud, platform, and infra teams? Honestly, it means a lot of the boring stuff just got more important. And I know that is not the sexy answer, but it is the real answer. If you run platform or infra, your job is not just uptime and throughput and deployment velocity. Your job is also making it harder for mistakes to connect. That is the lens. Make it harder for mistakes to connect. That means looking hard at identity boundaries. Do we have roles that are broader than they need to be? Do our pipelines have access they should not have? Can one compromise in one place turn into access somewhere much more sensitive? That means looking at credentials. Where do long lived credentials still exist? Where are secrets exposed to more systems than necessary? Where are we still relying on convenience over containment? That means looking at old compute and images. How stale are our base images? How stale are our AMIs? How many things are running because nobody wants to touch them? How many self hosted utilities are basically just squatting in the environment and hoping nobody notices? That means looking at network boundaries and trust assumptions. What internal services are reachable too broadly? What dashboards, admin surfaces, or support tooling have drifted into being more exposed than anyone intended? What old assumptions about internal means safe are still hanging around? And it means looking at rollout safety, because patching speed only matters if patching is survivable. If every patch feels like a mini heart attack because rollout is fragile and confidence is low, then your organization is going to move too slowly, exactly when slow movement starts costing more. That, to me, is the DevOps angle. Not AI will replace security engineers. No. This is more like the value of disciplined infrastructure and safer defaults just went up. I keep coming back to this phrase because I think it is the practical takeaway. Boring work just got promoted. Inventory, golden paths, patch automation, safer defaults, ephemeral credentials, cleaner ownership, faster rollback, less standing privilege, better dependency visibility, tighter separation between build, deploy, secrets, and runtime. That stuff is not glamorous. Nobody wants to do some chest thumping keynote about cleaning up permissions in some ugly deployment path. But this is exactly the kind of work that matters if the cost curve on offense is moving. Because when offense gets cheaper, defenders do not win by being more dramatic. They win by being less sloppy, less trust, less drift, less ambiguity, less hidden blast radius. This is not as fun to talk about as something big AI changes everything narrative. But it is the part that actually helps. So here's the uncomfortable takeaway. For years, security people have said defenders have the hardest job because defenders have to protect everything and attackers only need one path. That asymmetry is not new. What might be changing is the cost of finding that path. That is the part worth sitting with. If finding and chaining exploitable paths gets cheaper, then the old enterprise habit of living with moderate mess becomes a worse bet. We'll get to it next sprint. We should clean that up this quarter. Nobody really owns that, but it still works. We know the role is broad, but tightening it would take time. That thing is ugly, but touching it is risky. Those are all normal enterprise sentences, and they may be getting more expensive. That is really what this episode is about. Not panic, not hype, not AI fanfiction. Just a sober possibility. The exploit timeline may be collapsing faster than the enterprise cleanup timeline. And if that is true, then platform maturity is not cleanup work anymore. It is frontline security work. That is the shift. So if I were talking to a platform team or engineering leadership right now, I would not say panic. I would say go look where your environment is embarrassingly chainable. That is the phrase. Embarrassingly chainable. Not just what has a critical CVE. Not just what your scanner painted red this week. Look for where mistakes connect too easily. Can someone go from an internet-facing thing to an internal thing too easily? Can someone pivot from CI to secrets too easily? Can someone inherit cloud access they never should have had? Can one weird old service become a bridge into something much more important? Do you actually know what is exposed? Do you actually know what is privileged? Do you actually know what would be painful to patch fast? That is where I would start. And then I would ask the harder question. What cleanup work have we been treating like optional that maybe is not optional anymore? Because let's be honest, Most companies do not need a frontier model to tell them their permissions are too broad, their dependencies are stale, their ownership is fuzzy, and their patching process is slower than it should be. They already know that. The real question is whether the cost of leaving that mess alone is going up. I think it probably is. So, to wrap this up, Mythos might turn out to be a true inflection point. It might also turn out that some of the early narrative gets revised as more evidence comes out. Those things are not mutually exclusive. But if you work in DevOps, SRE, cloud, or platform engineering, the useful takeaway is pretty much the same either way. Assume your messy edges matter more. Assume your platform maturity is security work. Assume rollback, repair, and isolation matter even more than before. And assume we'll get to it later is getting riskier. That is the lesson that I would keep. Not fear, not hype, just this. If offensive capability is speeding up, then defensive maturity has to stop being treated like optional cleanup. The full show notes and links for this episode are on shipitweekly.fm. And if this episode got your brain moving a little bit, subscribe to the show wherever you listen. Follow, rate, review, share it with somebody who runs infra, security, or engineering. That stuff really does help. I'm Brian from Tellers Tech, and this has been Ship It Weekly. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.